Okay, thank you very much. We'll start now because otherwise we'll be under pressure of time. And I know that some people will drift in, and I hope that particularly the speaker will allow for that and not be sort of thrown by it, which I doubt will happen. This is the closing address for Blue Sky and the closing address for this series of Earth Itself. Keynote speakers can be locked into any point in a program, but I think it is both exciting and fitting to have Karen O'Brien give this keynote address this evening. I've said to her that I'm open to how long she speaks. It is customary for keynote speakers to not be asked questions. They deliver their address and then wander out or be applauded. But if she has time, she is happy to take questions. If not, you have heard during the reception and the book launch to corner and ask questions. Karen is Professor in the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo in Norway, as you can see yourself. And she's also the founder and a co-director of Sea Change, Global Warming, or Climate Change. I think it is Sea Change Climate Action, which is focusing on ways in which we begin to think through some of the dilemmas, including those we discussed earlier this afternoon, around the impact of climate change and the inevitabilities that we need to address now. And that includes thinking around narrating alternative futures and developing strategic action and so on. And in that respect, I think that Karen's interests fit very well with this week's conference with Blue Sky and with Blue Sky Thinking. So with no further comments, Karen, welcome. Thank you so very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Lenore, and it's really an honor to be invited here, and thank you for organizing such a stimulating 3 days. I really feel like I've been presented with so many perspectives, and especially in this last panel session on kind of the big picture of deep time and deep space. And what I want to do is present another perspective, and a little bit different one. Often when I've been working on climate change for about 30 years, looking at impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, including the implications for human security. And also, how does climate change interact with other global processes like globalization? And probably about 10 years ago, I started to look at transformation in relation to the idea about adaptation, that there are limits to adaptation. And maybe the biggest limit to adaptation is here in our head. How do we adapt to the very idea that we are transforming systems at this immense rate, scale, and speed? So my research currently is a project called Adaptation Connects, which stands for Combining Old and New Knowledge to Enable Conscious Transformations to Sustainability. And the idea is that successful adaptation to climate change is transformation. And so that's the starting point. So quantum social change, you matter more than you think, is kind of a passion project for me that's kind of a parallel to this idea of how do we transform our paradigms. And a lot of it really comes from I'm not a physicist, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm really interested in, how do we actually take advantage of the potential we have right now to limit global warming to 2 degrees or so, recognizing that there's such a huge difference between 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, etc. So I just want to, in my research, I'm always trying to put myself in the future and think, what are we missing? What is the perspective that we are lacking right now? And if we were to jump ahead 100 years, what would people say? Oh, it was right in front of them. They should have seen that. They had all that knowledge. It was there. And so I think if we were putting ourselves 100 years in the future, we would be saying oh, once upon a time, we lived in a very mechanical world, and it was atomistic, deterministic, materialist, and it was kind of like things occupying space, and it was a world of matter that was like, solid, liquid, gas, and plasma, and they had some idea about dark energy back then, and the goal was really to figure out how this machine worked and how they could make this machine work really well for them. And so in this world of the mechanistic Newtonian paradigm, they actually didn't think that they themselves mattered very much. They were just kind of like, oh, we were just little zombies. And then came climate change, and climate change kind of challenged that worldview. But along also in this time, they had a different paradigm, and that was quantum physics. Over 100 years ago, scientists started to discover a different view of reality. And every month or every week, we get new experiments that are telling us that reality isn't what we think. So I'm jumping ahead of myself, but I want to just go back now to, because I want to look at what this new paradigm might offer us as people in terms of understanding of social change. Now, climate change science is really important. It's played a huge role in diagnosing the problem and the challenges ahead of us. But when you start to look at what kind of climate science we have and what it offers for solutions, you start to see some potential limitations. Climate change science we frame climate change as an environmental problem, something in this separate box, or something that's happening out there driven by human activities. Many people find it a very abstract problem because climate is an abstraction. It's a statistical average. So when we frame it like that, we start to look at the solutions that actually address human activities. So, kind of the technical and behavioral responses that mitigate or adapt to climate change. And without that, we don't necessarily start to think about like the types of solutions that might involve a shift in our mindsets, how we view relationships between each other, ourselves, and other people, other species, future generations, etc. It's also a science that reduces individuals to rational, self-interested actors seeking to maximize well-being at a minimal cost. And we get down to treating people as objects to be changed. We must change those people so that we can actually address climate change, rather than allowing people to be the subjects of change themselves and the ones that can actually work collectively together. And it extrapolates the future based on past trends, including past trends in population, GDP, greenhouse gas emissions, energy, carbon intensity of energy, etc. And it doesn't actually include the role of consciousness and individual and collective agency to consciously change the change. Because I will argue that once one part of a system starts to recognize itself as changing the system itself changed. Well, what does climate change science tells us? Well, in 2017, researchers published this in Nature saying that we have 3 years to safeguard our climate, and now we're down to probably like 9 months or 8 months to actually do something about it. And you see that bending those curves is really steep, and it really it takes your breath away, and you say, oh my gosh, we can't do that. How would we do that? You also read, for example, in The Guardian that the planet has just a 5% chance of reaching the Paris climate goals, say these integrated assessment models. And if you were a planner and you just read the headlines, you just go, oh, I'm going to just plan for a 4-degree world or 5-degree world or 3-degree, whatever it is. And you would probably go on just thinking like we can't mitigate or reduce climate change. And I think that that's a really, people are just starting to say, oh, we just have to adapt. If you actually go and look at the article that they're basing this Guardian story on, it actually says that our forecasting model does not explicitly incorporate future legislation that could change future emissions. It's based on past emissions. We have also not accounted for the possibility that decreasing prices for alternative energy could cause a sudden massive shift to alternative energy. This would be speculative. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is also speculative, but it might not get published in Nature. So. But the idea is that these articles, the models do not take into account shifts in worldviews. They don't take into account young people being able to connect the dots in ways that we never were able to 30, 40 years ago. And so the idea of social change, of cultural change, of shifts in values and worldviews and priorities doesn't really come into account. But what we see instead is that people are starting to talk about deep adaptation. And this article, which was downloaded 100,000 times by Jem Bendel, says, currently I have chosen to interpret the information as indicating inevitable collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction. There's a growing community of people who conclude we face inevitable human extinction and treat that view as a prerequisite for meaningful discussions about the implications of our lives right now. And that is a very sobering conclusion to say that, we'd really, and we do, obviously, are we going to lose things? And obviously, we, the world is changing, as we just talked about in the last panel. But then, that idea that we just have to adapt to change rather than to change the change is, I think, interesting. And then we even get physicists like Carlo Rovelli in his 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, which was a phenomenal bestseller and sold millions of copies. In his chapter 7 on ourselves, he talks about us as being part of nature and connected with nature, and I think that's really great. But read further and he says, I believe our species will not last long. The brutal climate and environmental changes which we have triggered are unlikely to spare us. For the Earth, they may turn out to be a small, irrelevant blip, but I do not think we will outlast them unscathed, especially since public and political opinion prefers to ignore the dangers which we are running, hiding our heads in the sand. And so that's kind of like, you get all the wonders of physics, and then you get to like, wow, we're screwed. And I just wonder myself, like, wow, is that the best that we can do in terms of our analyses? And as a social scientist, I wonder, what kind of social science do we need? And interestingly, the next year, Rovelli published a book that says, reality is not what it seems. And he says that both relativity and quantum mechanics demand a daring reevaluation of our conventional ideas about the world, space and time in relativity, matter and energy in quantum theory. And he emphasizes that the search for knowledge is not nourished by certainty, it is nourished by a radical distrust in certainty. And so if we're very certain that we're going to be going extinct in the next years because of climate change, I think we need to have that radical distrust in certainty. We need to actually ask very different questions about our relationship to the planet and to the future. And another physicist, David Bohm, says, in scientific inquiries, a crucial step is to ask the right question. And so that brings me to what are the questions we need to ask. And I would say that one important question is, what if social reality is not what it seems? What if we are actually underestimating our collective capacity for social change? And this is something that in 100 years in the future, they may look back and say, like, wow, didn't they see that they were connected? And the research that I'm doing really is looking at these questions, not whether we can transform, but how can we transform at the scope, scale, speed, and depth that is called for by climate science and global change research in general. And how do we transform in an equitable, ethical, and sustainable manner? And this brings us to that relationship. What is the relationship between individual change, collective change, and systems change? And I think these are really important questions for us to be asking right now when transformation it's a buzzword that's getting onto everyone's agenda. What is transformation? Everybody talks about it, and there's many different definitions. And the ones that I like to refer to is that it's a physical and/or qualitative change in form, structure, or meaning making. And it can be all three of these. And the caterpillar turning into a butterfly is an excellent example because it changes its form, it changes the structure of its cells, and it changes its meaning making because the butterfly sees a very different world and engages with a different world than the caterpillar. But Monica Sharma also calls transformation the powerful unleashing of human potential to commit, care, and affect change for a better life. So there's also something internal in us wanting to transform and change, and that is kind of that nature. But it's also important to recognize that not every transformation is positive. How many of you in the audience like to be changed by someone else? Not many hands, a few hands. Or how many of you have been have you managed to successfully change someone else? Often, we got one. So often you can inspire people, you can actually create conditions for change in classrooms and in situations, but But usually it's somebody else's agenda. And we ran into this problem in the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, where the word transformation was contested by a number of countries that said, we don't want to be transformed again. We've had your structural adjustment programs, and now we're going to get your green economy, blah, 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 et cetera. And you realize that this is a very political word. And in working with transformations, I use a very simple heuristic to try to capture those changes in form, structure, and meaning making, which we refer to as the three spheres of transformation. And the idea, these aren't really separate in reality, but they're, they're always there. It's just more of a way of thinking about it. But when you start to think about how we've been going about transformations in relation to climate change over the last decades, you start to see that we are very much focused on that practical sphere. And this makes perfect sense because those are the measurable outcomes. That's where we can actually realize all their SDG targets, where we can see like, oh, 1.5 degrees. We want more solar panels, more people on bicycles. We want girls in schools. We want less meat or more plant-based diets, et cetera. And the practical field really is where we just, the technical behavioral stuff that we're really striving for. And much of our attention in adaptation and in mitigation is very practical these days. And we tend to get very frustrated because it's not happening fast enough, and things are going backwards in some cases. And that's often because we're forgetting about the political sphere, the systems and the structures, the rules, the norms, the institutions, the regulations that actually make it very easy to change in the practical sphere or difficult. And if we are still subsidizing fossil fuels and then wondering why renewable energies are not price competitive, you can scratch your head, but a report came out 2 weeks ago that we're still, 13 banks are still investing $1.9 trillion in the fossil fuel industry. And so you go, oh, why aren't those practical changes coming about? I don't know. But in this political sphere, we call it political because it's how we collectively organize society. It is our collective way of being, and it's where you get social movements. It's where you get the conflicts, where you get people kind of coming up against. It's why we have, as we heard from Timmons and others, like why we have 30 years to just try to get to a voluntary agreement on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. You get stuck in that political sphere and without a kind of inertia. So why don't we move forward? And that's because we often forget about the personal sphere. And the personal sphere is the individual and shared beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms through which we actually see the system. And sometimes in Earth system science, we just assume that everybody is looking at the same system with the same boundaries. But what you really see is like, oh, we all are kind of imagining different systems. Systems are abstractions. And so we're looking at different systems. We're seeing our role in relation to those systems very differently. We have very different goals for that practical sphere. If you have sustainable development as your goal, that's great. But if you also have continued economic growth, you're going to get a lot of competition in that political sphere on what to prioritize and when. So the beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms or thought patterns are really influencing the way that we've organized society and the type of practical responses that we're prioritizing. Often when I say this, people go, yes, 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 we just need to change people's beliefs, values, and worldviews. We're hearing a lot of that now. Let's just change values, which if you understand how values change, it doesn't happen by a scientist telling you to change your values. And that often means that we're just putting it into the practical sphere and making it just another thing on our to-do list. Change people's values, get them to ride bikes, da-da-da-da-da. Instead of actually activating communities to engage with change as the subjects of, from their perspective. How do we actually get healthy expressions of different worldviews and different values, priorities and things? So all of these are working together all the time, and it's not that these are, I work in the practical sphere. We're always coming at it from a perspective. And if any of you have heard of Donella Meadows' leverage points, places to intervene in a system, she came up with like 12 different leverage points where you can intervene in a system. And I think they kind of track on to these three spheres quite well, because she kind of says the constants, parameters, and numbers, which we tend to put like 99% of our effort, are often pushing the system in the wrong way. That we're just kind of tapping at the, with the interest rates and carbon taxes and things like that. And it's not necessarily creating much change. Much more effective is to work what she calls in the systems, you know, the feedback loops, the structure of information flows, and not the least the rules of the system. And these, I think, are very much correlated to that political sphere, because they do, once you change those, then it's very easy to just come up with, you know, the parameters and the numbers and change the buffers, et cetera. But the highest leverage points, and this is what I'm interested in, because I think in 2019 we really need to be working with the highest leverage points if we have a very short time to actually change things. It is the goals of the system, the mindset or paradigm from which the system arises. And her 12th is a very tricky one called the power to transcend paradigms, to hold your beliefs lightly and recognize that these are all beliefs. But I want to just walk a little bit through these, the personal sphere, and then get to why I think the paradigms really need to be shifting right now. And beliefs are our common, you know, collective understanding of, you know, what's true and real in the world, often based without any evidence. And when we start to look at the common belief out here today, I don't believe in climate change. And these 6 little words are really powerful, because they're basically saying that, you know, like, I don't believe that we are connected to the environment. I don't believe that we actually have any influence on this. I don't think we, you know, make a difference. And this is, if climate change science is showing us anything, it is that, you know, like, this is not a belief, it's an understanding of global systems and everything. So we've been dealing with that for decades now, of how to deal with people who don't believe in climate change. But what's, I think, even more effective is people who say, I don't believe I matter. And I mean many people who will, you know, kind of come out of a climate change talk just kind of like this, feeling like, oh, I don't really think anything I do is going to make a difference, because they are investing $1.9 trillion in fossil fuels, and they're building coal power plants in here, there, and there, and the United States is, you know, going in this direction, and China and Australia, you know, all of these things. And I think that idea then, if there's one thing that climate change showed us, is that we actually can transform systems. We can transform global systems to such an extent that, you know, that we do have to face that reality of potential collapse and extinction and everything. So I think those are really important, to start to look at what we believe and how, but it's also important to look at what worldview we are coming from. You know, what is the dominant worldview of our time? And a worldview is a particular philosophy of life or a conception of the world, and the worldview that has really dominated over the last several hundred years is an Enlightenment worldview. Mechanistic, atomistic, deterministic, materialistic, and generally matter is seen as just being dead, you know, nothing alive in it. And there are other worldviews, and indigenous worldviews, many different cultural worldviews that would not agree with this, but also that don't have the same power of the Enlightenment worldview. One of these is Andreas Weber's Enlivenment worldview, which really includes lived experience, embodied meaning, subjectivity, consciousness, interbeing, spirituality. And from this worldview, matter is alive. It's very much in the humanities too, vibrant matter, that, you know, the rest of the world also has agency. And that switch, you know, how do we see the world? Really, you know, it's the lenses we put on our, you know, when we approach issues like climate change adaptation, that influence not just the way we frame the problem, but the way that we frame the solutions. And this brings us then to values, because, you know, everyone's like, oh, values are so important. And when you start to look at what drives values and value change, Shalom Schwartz has this structure of values with 4 different motivations: conservation, self-enhancement, openness to change, and self-transcendence. And talks about values as being things, you know, we hold lots of different values, we just prioritize them at different times. So there might be times that, like, I really, you know, emphasize security values if I'm walking down a dark street or something, and other times stimulation or openness to change, benevolence, etc. And so, and values are expressed differently in different cultures. They're, you know, like they are very particular to it. But what we often forget is that these different values often come out in the political sphere as challenges to, you know, the way that we're organizing society. And what we're seeing right now with the youth rising up and going on strike, it's really a question of whose values count in deciding the future. Who is really, you know, like whose worldview, whose values are actually going to play out in what kind of outcomes we see for the future. So that becomes really important. And then we get to paradigms. And paradigms are defined as like a set of concepts, metaphors, and patterns of thought that underline theories and methods, especially of science. So from Donella Meadows' article on leverage point, she says paradigms are the sources of systems. From them, from shared social agreements about the nature of reality, come system goals and information flows, stocks flows, and everything else about systems are emerging from our paradigms. So not to, you know, like not to underestimate that power of paradigms to actually influence the future that we're seeing. But as I mentioned in the start, paradigms are already changing. You know, we are already like in a different paradigm. And in this article a few years ago, they kind of reflecting that quantum mechanics actually forced physicists to reshape their ideas of reality, to rethink the nature of things at the deepest levels, and to revise their concepts of position and speed, as well as the notions of cause and effect. And all this is at the subatomic level or the cosmic level or something, not at the social level where we're dealing with mitigation, adaptation, and transformations to sustainability, or maybe not. And quantum physics has really turned physics on its head because it's the most successful theory in physics, yet we still don't know how to interpret its meaning in a bigger picture. The Copenhagen interpretation, which many of you are probably familiar with it with Schrodinger's cat, is that the measurement itself collapses the wave of potentiality into a certain outcome. So it's really saying that the observer actually influences the experiment, the observation itself, whether the cat is alive or dead. Or in Niels Bohr's words, you know, that we are part of nature that we are trying to study. And so this is, you know, this has kind of turned people on their heads and like, oh my gosh, is that, you know, so there's nothing objective about reality. We are subjects are always, the subject-object duality is not real. But there are many other interpretations, and one of them that many physicists adhere to just for its mathematical cleanliness or whatever, is the many worlds interpretation that every possible thing is happening in some parallel universe, that we have trillions of universes, and we just happen to be in the one that we're in because this is the one we're in. And I think this is, it surprises me that a lot of the physicists are supporting this thing, but I guess it's, you know, it makes mathematical sense. But I always ask, why am I in this universe? Can't I just go into the one that is sustainable? And, you know, how do we get there? And then I think, okay, that's a collective challenge for all of us. But the interpretations of quantum physics are constantly changing and constantly being challenged. And this one on quantum Bayesianism or cubism comes from quantum information theory. And these scientists are saying that quantum mechanics is not a description of the world, but it's a technique for comprehending it. And they're really saying that it's the information we have about a system that actually influences how we engage with the system. So our beliefs or what we bet on the system is what we kind of see, like Bayesian probabilities, and that we're constantly updating our beliefs. And that brings me back to that belief that, oh, it's a 4-degree warming or nothing, that we start to actualize that reality just because we give up on, like, oh, there is no possibility for 1.5 or 2 degrees, you know. And so I think this is a really interesting, and this is, you know, getting a lot of attention now. Just because it's a very different doesn't mean that you have to have the cat dead or alive or collapsing the wave function, but it is just on what information are we taking in, what are our beliefs about that system. So they talk about really a participatory agency, that we are not separate from the world. It brings the scientist into the research, which is really interesting. Quantum physics, again, you know, has been so, yeah, that's all fine for the subatomic level of, you know, like photons and electrons and leptons and gluons and all those little things down there. But what we're finding is that it also influences life in general. And the emerging field of quantum biology is showing us that, you know, quantum physics actually influences things like photosynthesis and sense of smell and bird navigation and all these things where just little things make a big difference for that larger system. And I don't know if it's tongue-in-cheek, but they say quantum mechanics is normal. It's the world that it describes that is weird. And so here we are in this weird world. We're trying to understand social change. And if we don't actually take into account some of these insights and challenges from quantum physics, then we may be missing something important. And this is where you look at where quantum physics is actually coming into social sciences. And it actually has been part of social science from the very start, but a very minor part. And quantum social science can be used methodologically, just taking the mathematical formalisms and using it in the, these authors say it's a goal to investigate problems within the wide remit of social sciences, economics, finance, psychology, sociology, and other domains of inquiry with the help of these formal models. And for example, quantum decision-making makes use of the underlying mathematical formalisms, and it provides actually a better account of human thinking than traditional models of expected utility functions, et cetera. Quantum game theory dissolves the prisoner's dilemma because you can actually have different outcomes and preference reversals, et cetera. And one methodology that I use is Q methodology, which is trying to find subjective attitudes about people, and it's really about how they collapse their preferences and sorting things at a particular time. And so all of these things make it seem like, oh, quantum methodologies actually could help us a lot. But it's not just the methodologies, it's also about our understanding of mattering. And Karen Barad, who's a feminist theorist and a physicist, has come up with something called agential realism, similar to participatory agency, that is based on the inseparability of objects and subjects, like the Copenhagen interpretation. And she sees ourselves, we are agents of observation that participate within nature, and thus we are constituting reality every second. And so she is looking at objectivity as contextual, embodied, simultaneously material and cultural. And she says the boundaries are not fixed and the future is radically open. And matter, for Barad, is not a thing but a doing, a congealing of agency through which phenomena come to matter. And that is, I think, also very important because we are like events, we are processes that are just occurring over and over. Change is a process, and we're just materializing it here and here and here. And then we get to a more radical and more recent interpretation by Alexander Wendt, who is a theorist in international relations, very highly respected. And he started to look at his own theories of constructivism and the critiques from realists and started to say, what if we're all wrong? What if we are all basing our social science on a very classical Newtonian idea of physics instead of quantum physics? And his idea is, he uses quantum his quantum social theory builds on quantum brain theory and panpsychism and things that may be a little bit speculative, but is also being researched in science. And his idea is that the conceptual, logical, and methodological tools of quantum theory offer us potential for revealing new social phenomena. And he's saying that if human beings really are quantum, then classical social science is essentially founded on a mistake, and social science will therefore require a quantum framework for its proper understanding. And this is quite radical, especially in international relations, yet it's created a stir. I think this year at the International Studies Associations, there were 4 panels on quantum social science and quantum social change. So let me just get to, what does this actually mean for social change if we are interested in transformations at this rate, scale, speed, and depth that is unprecedented in human history? And the first, I think, is that words matter. Language matters. And this is kind of what Wendt is building his idea on. But even metaphors matter. From George Lakoff and Mark Johnson back in 1980 wrote that new metaphors have the power to create a new reality. And this can begin to happen when we start to comprehend our experience in terms of a metaphor, and it becomes a deeper reality when we begin to act in terms of it. Much of cultural change arises from the introduction of new metaphorical concepts and the loss of old ones. So the words that we use are actually mattering. And we can see that the concept, the word entanglement as a metaphor is already used widely in our language. And you just say, oh, we are entangled. And, and in quantum physics, entangled means correlated. It doesn't mean that, this causes this, but it means non-locally we affect two things are very much linked or correlated without anything transmitting by the speed of light. This is a picture of one photon actually influencing 3,000 atoms from MIT, a study in MIT. And I think, like, metaphorically, you just see like, when we don't actually have to influence each other very directly, but just through language, through meaning, we are connected, we are entangled. Complementarity is a principle that holds that objects have certain pairs of complementary properties that can't be observed or measured at the same time. So that this is like position and momentum, or waves and particles, or entanglement and coherence. It really gets us to this idea of both and I think throughout this, the 3 days, you hear that, like, paradox is something that we have a hard time holding. That it's like, oh, this could be both this and that, depending on how we look at it and what that context is. And that's another one. But also then potentiality. You know, we talk about these kind of probabilities and possibilities, and we don't actually look at the full potential that exists in every moment through the language, through what we're doing, and what that possibility is. And I think at this point, we really actually have to explore the potentiality rather than just the probabilities, because we know where the probabilities are heading us. Another aspect that is important for quantum social change is relationships. Relationships really matter, and this is, you know, part of social science, but systems are relationships, the connections between parts to form a larger whole. And if we start to include humans as part of the system, then we start to affect that system. And the question is whether we're starting to see ourselves as part of a classical system of separated parts that are connected through these interactions, or a quantum system that is actually one whole system that is entangled non-locally. So those, I think, are you know, just some ideas. And if we have like modeled ourselves as these individual agents of like kind of stupid marbles that we are, you know, classed according to size and luminosity and colors and things like that, and we're separate and we're just trying to veer ourselves to change, it gives us a very difficult challenge compared to if we actually see ourselves as both waves and particles, where we are individuals and we are collectives. We are constantly transmitting information and energy to each other and receiving it from each other, and we are connected through language and through meaning. And so it has a very different implication. And as Wendt writes, he goes, we're social scientists to embrace the quantum worldview, then instead of seeing human beings as separate elements in causal interaction, we ought to see them too as correlated projections of a common ground. So that means that, you know, like, if we can see ourselves as connected, we might see a very different future. Well, what does that mean then in terms of, you know, how do we shift systems? And this is where consciousness comes in. And consciousness is very rarely brought up at global change meetings. I don't think it's in the index of the IPCC reports. I think maybe be conscious of climate change. But consciousness itself is a concept and phenomena that is very difficult to define and controversial. And in classical physics, you know, it's like it doesn't necessarily even exist as a reality. It's something that happens just because our neurons are connecting and gives us this feeling that we have free will, that we have some sense of agency, that we are subjects. But it really is just our brain, you know, lighting up lots of different neural connections. So at a time when we are supposed to be working together to bend the curves on climate change, and the future is a choice between 1.5 and 4 degrees or more change, if science is telling us we don't have free will, we don't have agency, then there's a little problem there, because then who is doing the changing for us? And often that's where power and politics come in. Quantum physics, some interpretations of quantum physics bring in consciousness not as, oh, I can use my consciousness to collapse the wave in a certain way, but consciousness as the collapse of the wave function, as experience, as our awareness. And that's where Wendt and others are using it. It's like that consciousness as fundamental, as part of the reality that we exist in. And I think that that becomes a really important part that is not covered, because also, you know, in consciousness studies, integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi looks at how you know, we integrate information to have this awareness, and that develops also over time. He doesn't write about this, but many of us don't see the whole, don't see the big picture. We saw a graph that many of us are focused on daily, you know, what's today, you know, what am I going to eat, what am I going to do, everything, not this deep time thing. And we're often, our worldview, our consciousness is very much focused on very fragmented pieces, and create these divisions and separations between us and others because we don't necessarily kind of see ourselves together. And again, physicist David Bohm says, recognize fragmentation as being a real problem also in science, where we have these silos and we have these areas of expertise rather than bringing them together. And his book, Wholeness and Implicate Order, is really good on integrated research in its first chapters. But he says what is primarily needed is a growing realization of the extremely great danger of going on with a fragmentary process of thought. And I think that that's one of the challenges of integrated global change research is to overcome that fragmentation in thought. And finally, we talked about quantum Bayesianism and the importance of beliefs. And beliefs really do matter because, is it a question of do we believe what we see, being like a realist, or do we see what we believe, like constructivist or idealist? And I think often, we tend, it's probably a little bit of both, but we do tend to define problems based on what we already believe them to be. And when we already believe ourselves to have no future in the world, that it is impossible to limit climate change to 2 degrees warming because politics is this way and people are that way and this is the way it is, then you just start to see like we're not necessarily seeing that full potentiality that exists right now in that we're going into this fragmented thought and the belief that this can't be done. And so if there's anything we know that it's, if we believe that this, that we're not going to make it till the end of the century, then we probably will not be investing in renewable energies. We probably will not be doing the type of collaborative powers. We probably will be like just kind of going down like, oh, this is just the way it was. We were so stupid. We should have done something 30 years ago, 40 years ago when we first, it kind of becomes into this, this fatalism and inevitability rather than in the potentiality of our collective change. And so it brings me to this idea that time really does matter. And quantum physics, I could go into, Carlo Rovelli wrote a book about the nature of time and time doesn't exist. And then quantum physics introduces backward causation and all of these things that just, but from my perspective, and I think many of you in the room, like we don't have much time to change. We don't actually have 40, 50, 60 years to get it right because of tipping points, because of feedbacks in the system. And so that idea that like, wow, how do we change things at this amazing scale in a very quick period of time? That's where the metaphor of the quantum leap becomes very important. That how do we go from this fragmentary, reductionist, homogeneous, deterministic, materialist worldview that it seems to be rising up today, that to be gaining in popularity, to one that is whole, inclusive, uncertain, diverse, and also conscious. So that idea of making whereas things seem to be regressing to an earlier period, how do we actually make that leap? And that leap isn't like that we just wait for the new paradigm to come. It's actually there already. There are people who are living the new paradigm. How do we occupy that paradigm in every moment? And that then brings me to like, well, how do we do that? How do we actually one of the first questions is how do we scale up change? How do we scale out change? How do we scale deep? How do we scale wide, et cetera? And I think that this brings us to the role of individuals. And when I say individuals, the individuals as we, as a collective, how do we actually matter? And if we start to see ourselves as both particles and waves, how do we transform the systems and the structures in that political sphere in an effective way, equitable way? How do we actually, the politics is sobering here, but it's that political sphere where we have to act. And Alexander Wendt, in his book, he's actually looking at systems theories, and he says, in effect, social structures are continuously popping in and out of existence with the practices through which they're instantiated. What is going on here is more accurately described as structures being pulled out of the quantum world of potentiality into the classical world of actuality by agents. And he goes on to describe that this doesn't mean that social structures have no causal power, but he's saying that there aren't these like levels of a structure is real and it's above us and it's affecting us, but that we are constantly agreeing on that. We just go, and I have experienced this in my own life. There's a logic that you should say like, oh yes, I should do this because of this. And then you say, wait a minute, I could actually do something very different in this moment. I can act differently. We are wired for social connection. Social norms are important. We feel social pain in the same place that we feel our physical pain, according to Matthew Lieberman in his book Social. And so those ideas that, like how do we get out of our own way? How do we stand outside of those norms for a larger, based on values that are collective and shared for the whole. And this is where I think like a fractal approach. Fractals are similar, self-repeating patterns that and we see fractals all over in nature, in geometry, in algebra, but we also see it in society, that you get these patterns that are repeating over and over. If our fractals are based on values of individualism and profit and me first and things like that, it goes from your very personal life to your workplace, to your city, to your country. It's a self-repeating pattern. And if we decide to say, like, wait a minute, what if my fractal has integrity? What if my fractal is actually repeating something that is good for the whole? We would get a very different pattern emerging over time. And I would say that we'd even need to look at quantum fractals. I found that, like, oh, they've even observed a quantum a fractal at the quantum level. But what I mean by quantum fractals would be that when we do something like that, that we actually are influencing others non-locally. We are creating a new pattern that then actually influences the whole. And that's often through language. It's often when we talk about the changes, but also the way we talk about changes, not like you should do this, but in terms of engaging communities and neighbors and family and things with these conversations at a very different type of level, so that you're actually, kind of like empowering the particle self, but also like amplifying that wave function to include much more of that reality. And this gets into creativity. We've talked a lot about art and science relationships over these 3 days. And again, David Bohm, who was really thinking about these types of things deeply decades ago, says that the root trouble is in the confusion between what is really creative and the mechanical continuation of the results of past conditioning. So we tend to just keep doing the same and same and same and same, and without actually doing anything truly what he would call generative and creative. And I think at this point we actually have to start to think, how can we actually create creative change or generate change that is not just a repetition of the same old in the past. Not to say that some things from the past should not actually be continued in the future, and I think that's where I am so I'm probably the most conservative person around, because I just think we should have like zero climate change and zero species loss. And so, but how do we do that? And that becomes then, like a question for all of us is like, can we be creative in every moment as we collapse these wave functions into reality? Now, probably many of you are going like, oh my gosh, she's crazy. This is like, oh, this is, like, we'll never get to quantum social change, or, what is this? But I think many of us are actually just living in a little bit of a bubble, that we think, like that the rest of the world is, like we live in this idea that like the environmental change is everything, and we don't necessarily realize that like that this bubble is our bubble, and that we're not connecting with people, and we're not allowing people to feel like they actually matter, that they are the subjects of their lives, that they can actually change, that we can change collectively. And that really is about power. And I mean, I think this whole issue comes down to who has power, who do we give power to, and can we empower ourselves collectively for these changes? Someone in the last section was talking about how we adapt to things. We just seem to be adapting, oh, the warmest year on record, not challenging those very assumptions that are behind those adaptations. And the more we challenge the assumptions, including the assumptions about social change, I think the more we start to see that, indeed, we actually do matter, literally, figuratively, and, and just in terms of our being here. And when people look back 100 years ago today, I think they will scratch their heads like, they kind of got it with climate change, that they were making a systemic difference, but they never really thought that they mattered collectively. So I'd like to just leave it at that and say that, at the end of the day, we do matter much more than we think, and the future is, potentiality is what we should go for. So thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Or? Sure, I can do.
Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions only. I know that Karen has given us all a lot of things to think about, and it may be difficult to actually think of a question in the no, there's a hand. Is that a hand up? There's a shout it out, and I'll repeat it in this.
I like to talk very much, but I thought since we began talking about the generation that probably has to implement this change, have you actually considered the experience of loss and actually disappointment that the people that change. So our generation has experienced disappointment through actually being informed about social activism. And related to that question is, our generation as well has experienced that systems aren't that positive. You know, our social identity and collective memory is challenged or channeled through a system of exploitation. And I think like, well, a lot of things you said were really interesting. They kind of don't really echo what comprehensive theory and development theory basically says. Systems aren't that positive and they are flawed and they are cancerous. And I think like mediating that disappointment and the flaws in what can be a system is something where, you know, potential could flip as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you might want to just quickly repeat
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair to be critical. That's, you know, not all systems are good, and that's the whole point, that we have created these systems based on a hierarchical worldview, based on the idea that some people are expendable, some people don't really care about losers, and we have constructed a society around those exact things, and we have been working for generations to actually overcome that. And the idea that I mean, this is not to say that there will not be losses, that we are, I mean, my generation is profoundly disappointed as well about the, you know, like what we expected and things, and yet we just keep going on along with these models, and we get sold these different things, and it's like, where do we challenge those, and where is that resistance? Do we resist within the system? Do we go against the system, or do we create the alternatives that actually undermine the systems? And I think the generation today is working more and more on undermining those systems, saying, we don't want, you know, we want degrowth, we want a different way, but that idea that, you know, like, it's that holding that paradox of we will lose things. It is, you know, that we like, it is a really, you know, like, sad reality of, and it not just, I don't think of it as, I think climate change is this entry point. If we address it, we start to address many other issues, because it really does come down to where you draw the line between us and other, and who's included in your group, and your social consciousness and awareness. And the 60s was this blossoming of social consciousness, but then this contraction back down to individual egoism and things. So, but developmentally, not developmental, like development economics, but developmentally, psychologically, we have this capacity to develop a more inclusive social consciousness where we resonate with a wider group, including other species, you know, non-humans, et cetera. And so I think that the potentiality is there, but I don't, you know, all I can say is we can do better, because there is, again, that difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees and 2 degrees more. And so there's many things that have to be addressed, but if we start to address it deeper, we should address many, you know, inequities and oppression and exclusion and many of the other things. So that's what I was trying to get at through this, is that we can't just look at climate issues in an environment box. It's a social issue.
Okay, I'm happy to take another question. If you want to ask a question, would you please hop behind the microphone? Wave your hand so I know that there is a question coming. No? Or yes? Yes, please.
I wonder if the concept of tipping point is useful. And it's usually about how things are going to go very bad. And because he said something about changing the change, and a tipping point seems to be about change begetting change and accelerating change. But whether there's a possibility now that the tipping point is in society and in consciousness, because it does seem like that's almost necessary to change all these curves that everyone is predicting that are pretty negative. And anyway, and whether that's a useful way to talk about what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I think that's really part of it. And I kind of left out slides that I usually put in on social tipping points, because what they see, people are working on social tipping points with agent-based modeling and with like looking at how people deal with water policies and things. And what this research shows is that it takes about like one study showed it takes about 10% of the population to have a shared very strong belief to start to shift everyone's belief in this, and they have a nice graph of that. And others say it's like 24% to be, you need people who will follow the water policies and then others follow. And that's the importance also of, just in a very classical sense of social norms actually influencing other people. And I think that that works in that classical agent-based rational thing that we are social beings. And that's, I see that in Norway with electric cars and with vegetarian food, that it just was very sudden that suddenly all the grocery stores had that, because it became a much more social norm with young people, like, vegetarianism is on the rise, and suddenly everybody has an electric car, and they were just estimating that in a few years they won't be selling regular automobiles. So those things spread, and then people are coming to Norway, and so absolutely the social tipping points is what we should be looking for, and what are the early warning signs of social tipping points, and how do we accelerate them?
Okay, which I think is a nice way to end, because your question sounded to me that a tipping point was a tip to the negative, and you flipped it to the tip to the positive. How do we begin or how do we fast forward some of those tipping points or take advantage of them? Thank you for what was a very stimulating keynote, and if you will all join me in thanking Karen, and then we'll have